The rope creaked in the desert wind, casting dancing shadows across the dusty ground where hundreds had gathered to witness justice. But as the notorious outlaw Jack Black Thunder Morrison stood on the gallows platform, his piercing blue eyes weren't focused on death. They were locked on a woman in the crowd whose face had gone white as fresh snow. "Sarah," he called out, his voice cutting through the jeers and catcalls like a knife through silk. "Sarah Mackenzie, you know who I am." The woman stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her chest, shaking her head frantically. But everyone could see the recognition in her eyes, the terror that went deeper than fear of any outlaw. This wasn't the look of a stranger caught in a madman's final delusion. This was the look of a woman staring at a ghost from her past. What the crowd didn't know was that Jack Morrison had spent 3 years searching every town, every settlement, every hidden corner of the frontier for the woman he claimed was his wife. A woman who had vanished without a trace on their wedding night, leaving behind only a blood-stained dress and a mystery that had driven him to a life of crime. Now, with the noose around his neck and minutes left to live, he had found her. But Sarah Mackenzie wore a different name, lived a different life, and stood beside a man she called husband. The question that would haunt everyone present wasn't whether Jack Morrison would hang. It was whether the woman he claimed to love would finally tell the truth about what really happened on that fateful night 3 years ago. As the executioner reached for the lever, Sarah's carefully constructed world was about to crumble, revealing secrets that would shake the very foundations of everything the townspeople thought they knew about justice, love, and the thin line between victim and villain. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Dry Creek, Arizona, as townspeople gathered in the dusty square for what everyone expected to be a routine execution. Jack Morrison, known throughout the territory as Black Thunder, had finally been caught after a 3-year reign of terror that included bank robberies, stagecoach holdups, and the deaths of 2 lawmen. The whole town had turned out to see justice served. Sarah Mackenzie stood near the back of the crowd, her arm linked through her husband's, trying to appear as composed as any respectable banker's wife should. She wore her finest blue dress, the one with tiny pearl buttons that caught the morning light, and her auburn hair was pinned up in the elaborate style that had become her trademark since moving to Dry Creek 2 years ago. To everyone around her, she was the picture of refined respectability. But when the prisoner was led up to the gallows platform, something inside Sarah's chest turned to ice. The man they called Black Thunder moved with a predator's grace despite the heavy shackles around his wrists and ankles. His dark hair hung in waves to his shoulders, and a beard covered the lower half of his face, but those eyes, those impossibly blue eyes, were exactly as she remembered them. They swept over the crowd like a hunter seeking prey, and when they found her, they stopped. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "What's wrong?" her husband Thomas asked, leaning closer with concern. Thomas Mackenzie was a good man, steady and kind with soft brown eyes and gentle hands that had never known violence. He had found Sarah wandering the desert roads 3 years ago, half dead from thirst and exposure, claiming to remember nothing but her first name. He had nursed her back to health, fallen in love with her mysterious past and gentle nature, and married her within 6 months. Nothing, Sarah managed, but her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. Just the heat. On the platform, Sheriff Williams was reading the charges in a loud, clear voice that carried across the square. "Jack Morrison, also known as Black Thunder, you've been found guilty of robbery, murder, and terrorizing the good people of this territory. Do you have any last words?" The outlaw's gaze never wavered from Sarah's face. A slow smile spread across his features, and he straightened his shoulders as if he were about to address a gathering of old friends rather than the people who had come to watch him die. "I do have something to say," Jack called out, his voice strong and clear. "I want to tell you all about my wife." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew that Black Thunder had ridden alone, that he trusted no one and kept no permanent companions. The idea of him having a wife seemed absurd. 3 years ago, Jack continued, his eyes still locked on Sarah, "I married the most beautiful woman in all of Colorado Territory. Her name was Sarah Jane Wilson, and she had hair like autumn fire and eyes the color of prairie grass in spring." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She took a step backward, but the crowd was packed tight around her, and there was nowhere to go. "We were married in a little church outside Denver," Jack went on, his voice carrying easily over the silent crowd. "The preacher was a man named Father Miguel, and the witnesses were my friend Pete Hawkins and Sarah's cousin Emily. After the ceremony, we went to the boarding house where I'd taken a room. We were going to start a new life together, away from the troubles of my past." Thomas looked down at his wife with growing confusion. "Sarah, you're trembling. What's wrong?" But Sarah couldn't speak. Her throat had closed up completely, and her heart was pounding so hard she was sure everyone around her could hear it. That night, Jack continued, his voice growing harder. "Something happened. I woke up to find my wife gone. Her dress was on the floor, torn and bloody. The window was broken, and there were signs of a struggle. I searched everywhere for her, but it was like she'd vanished into thin air." He paused, and in that silence, Sarah could hear nothing but the rushing of blood in her ears. "The sheriff in Denver told me she was probably dead, killed by bandits or wild animals. But I never believed it. I knew Sarah was alive somewhere, and I swore I'd find her. I've spent every day of the last 3 years searching for my wife, and I've done things I'm not proud of to get the money and resources I needed for that search." The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "I robbed banks to pay for information. I held up stagecoaches carrying men who might have seen her. I killed 2 lawmen who tried to stop me from continuing my search. Everything I've done, every crime I've committed has been in service of one goal: finding the woman I love." Jack's smile grew wider, and there was something wild and desperate in his eyes. "And now I've found her." His arm came up slowly despite the shackles, and he pointed directly at Sarah. "There she is, standing right there in that blue dress. My wife, Sarah Jane Wilson, who somehow became Sarah Mackenzie and convinced everyone, including herself, that she's someone else entirely." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and turned to stare at Sarah, who stood frozen like a deer caught in a hunter's sights. "No," Sarah whispered, then louder, "No, that's not true. I don't know this man." But even as she said it, flashes of memory were breaking through the careful barriers she had built in her mind. A small church filled with wildflowers. The feeling of lace against her skin as she put on a wedding dress. Strong hands lifting her over the threshold of a boarding house room. The sound of her own laughter as someone she loved spun her around in a circle. "She's been living here for 2 years as the banker's wife," Jack called out to the crowd. "Ask her about the scar on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. Ask her about the birthmark on her hip that looks like a butterfly. Ask her about the way she hums Amazing Grace when she's nervous. She's doing it right now." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She had been humming without even realizing it. Thomas turned to face her fully, his brown eyes wide with shock and confusion. "Sarah? What is he talking about? Who are you?" "I don't know," Sarah said, and it was the truth. The memories were coming faster now. tumbling over each other like water through a broken dam. She remembered the church, the dress, the feeling of being deliriously happy. But she also remembered pain, terrible pain, and darkness and the sound of men's voices raised in anger. She doesn't remember, Jack said, and for the first time, his voice softened slightly. Something happened to her that night, something that made her forget who she was. But I remember everything, Sarah. I remember the way you looked in your wedding dress. I remember the promises we made to each other. I remember how we planned to build a ranch together and raise horses and children. Stop, Sarah whispered, pressing her hands to her temples. Please stop. But Jack wasn't finished. I remember finding you gone and spending 3 years believing I'd failed to protect the only person who ever loved me for who I really was, not what I could give them or what I could do for them. I remember becoming the man they called Black Thunder because the man I used to be, the man who believed in love and hope and second chances, died the night my wife disappeared. Sheriff Williams had been listening to this exchange with growing impatience. That's enough, he called out. Time to finish this. Wait, Thomas said suddenly, stepping forward. He looked up at Jack with an expression of desperate confusion. If what you're saying is true, if she really is your wife, then what happened that night? Where has she been for 3 years? Jack's eyes hardened. That's what I'd like to know. Because Sarah didn't just disappear on her own. Someone took her, someone wanted to hurt me, or hurt her, or both. Someone who's been watching us both for 3 years, probably laughing at how well their plan worked. You're saying someone kidnapped her? Thomas asked. I'm saying someone destroyed our lives and got away with it. And now, they're probably in this crowd somewhere, watching this whole scene play out exactly the way they planned it. Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak, and she swayed on her feet. Thomas caught her arm to steady her, but she barely felt his touch. More memories were flooding back now, coming in waves that threatened to overwhelm her. She remembered being in the boarding house room with Jack, remembered feeling safe and loved for the first time in her adult life. She remembered the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside, footsteps that didn't belong to any of the other guests. She remembered Jack getting up to check the door, remembered him turning back to her with a worried expression. Then everything went dark and confused. There were men in the room, men with rough voices and rougher hands. There was a struggle, the sound of breaking glass, pain exploding through her skull. Then nothing but darkness for what felt like forever. When she finally woke up, she was lying beside a desert road with no memory of how she'd gotten there. A kind stranger, Thomas, had found her and taken her to town. The doctor said she'd suffered a severe head injury that had caused memory loss. Everyone assumed she'd been attacked by bandits and left for dead. But now, looking up at the man on the gallows platform, Sarah realized that the attack hadn't been random at all. Someone had deliberately torn apart her life and Jack's life, and they had done it so thoroughly that even she had believed the lie. I remember, she whispered, so quietly that only Thomas heard her. What did you say? Thomas asked, his face pale. Sarah looked up at him, this good man who had saved her life and given her a new one, and felt her heart breaking for both of them. I remember some of it. Not everything, but enough. The crowd around them had grown restless, but Sheriff Williams held up his hand for quiet. Something in Sarah's manner had caught his attention. Mrs. Mackenzie, the sheriff called out, do you have something you want to say about these accusations? Sarah felt every eye in the crowd turn toward her. Her mouth was dry as dust, and her hands were shaking, but she knew she had to speak. Too many lives have been destroyed by lies and secrets already. I don't remember everything, she said, her voice barely carrying over the crowd. But I remember enough to know that he's telling the truth about some of it. I do remember a church. I remember a wedding dress. I remember being happy. Thomas made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. Sarah, you can't be serious. I remember waking up beside the desert road where you found me, Sarah continued, looking up at her husband with tears in her eyes. But now I also remember what happened before that. There were men in our room, men who weren't supposed to be there. They hurt both of us, and they took me away. Why? Thomas asked, his voice breaking. Why would someone do that? Sarah looked up at Jack, who was watching her with an expression of desperate hope and carefully controlled rage. I don't know, she admitted, but I think Jack is right about one thing. I think whoever did this is probably here right now, watching all of this happen. She turned slowly, scanning the faces in the crowd around her. Most of them showed nothing but curiosity and shock, but there near the front of the crowd, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A man in an expensive suit was watching the proceedings with a small, satisfied smile on his face. He was older than most of the other townspeople, with silver hair and cold gray eyes. Sarah had seen him around town before. He owned several businesses and was rumored to have political ambitions, but she had never paid much attention to him. Now, though, something about the way he was looking at Jack triggered another flash of memory. She had seen those cold gray eyes before, on the night her life was destroyed. Marcus Thornton, she whispered, and the name felt like poison on her tongue. The name Marcus Thornton fell from Sarah's lips like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread through the entire crowd. Near the front of the gathering, the silver-haired man's satisfied smile faltered for just a moment before returning, but that brief hesitation was enough to confirm Sarah's growing suspicions. Sheriff Williams caught the exchange and held up his hand to halt the execution proceedings. Years of law enforcement had taught him to recognize when a simple case was about to become complicated, and the look on Marcus Thornton's face suggested that this hanging was about to reveal secrets that some people had worked very hard to keep buried. Mrs. Mackenzie, the sheriff called out, would you like to explain that remark? Sarah felt the weight of hundreds of stares pressing down on her, but for the first time in 3 years, her mind felt truly clear. The memories were still fragmented, coming in pieces like a broken mirror, slowly being put back together. But each piece revealed more of the picture she had lost. I remember those eyes, she said, pointing directly at Marcus Thornton. They were the last thing I saw before everything went dark. Thornton stepped forward with the confident air of a man accustomed to controlling situations through money and influence. He was well-dressed in a tailored black suit and carried himself with the bearing of someone who expected to be listened to and obeyed. Sheriff Williams, Thornton said in a smooth, cultured voice, I think we're all witnessing the unfortunate effects of a head injury combined with the stress of hearing wild accusations from a condemned man. Mrs. Mackenzie has been through a terrible trauma, and now this outlaw is manipulating her confused memories for his own purposes. Is that so? Sheriff Williams asked, but his hand had moved to rest on the butt of his pistol. Something about Thornton's eagerness to explain away Sarah's accusations struck him as suspicious. Jack Morrison laughed from the gallows platform, a sound with no humor in it at all. Marcus Thornton, he said, as if he were tasting something bitter. I should have known. You always did like to destroy things you couldn't have. I have no idea what you're talking about, Thornton replied coolly, but Sarah noticed that his hand had begun to tremble slightly. Don't you? Jack shot back. Tell me, Marcus, how's your mining operation up in Colorado doing these days? Still trying to buy up land that doesn't belong to you? A murmur went through the crowd. Most of the people in Dry Creek knew that Marcus Thornton had made his fortune in mining, but Few knew the details of how he had acquired his various properties and claims. Sarah closed her eyes and let the memories flow without fighting them. She remembered now why Jack's name had seemed familiar when she first heard it 3 years ago. She remembered conversations around Denver about a young rancher named Jack Morrison who was standing in the way of Marcus Thornton's plans to expand his mining operations. "You wanted his land," she said suddenly, opening her eyes to stare directly at Thornton. "Jack owned a ranch with water rights that you needed for your mining operation. But he wouldn't sell to you, no matter how much money you offered." Thornton's composed expression cracked slightly. Even if that were true, which it isn't, it would hardly justify the wild accusations being made here today. Wouldn't it? Jack called out from the platform. "Tell them about the last offer you made me, Marcus. The one where you said I'd regret not taking your money." Thomas Mackenzie had been standing silently beside his wife, his face a mask of pain and confusion as he watched his carefully ordered world fall apart around him. But now he spoke up, his banker's mind beginning to see the pattern of financial manipulation that might lie beneath the personal tragedy. "Mr. Thornton," Thomas said, "you've been trying to buy property here in Dry Creek as well, haven't you? You approached me just last month about purchasing the mineral rights to several parcels of land that the bank holds mortgages on." Thornton turned to face Thomas with an expression of barely controlled irritation. "I'm a businessman, Mackenzie. I pursue legitimate opportunities. That hardly makes me guilty of whatever crimes this outlaw is trying to pin on me." But Sarah was remembering more now, and the pieces were fitting together in a way that made her stomach churn with revulsion and rage. "You didn't just want the land," she said, her voice growing stronger. "You wanted to destroy Jack completely. You knew that if something happened to me, if I disappeared or died, Jack would either give up and sell to you or become so consumed with grief and rage that he'd do something stupid and get himself killed or imprisoned. And it worked perfectly, didn't it?" Jack added, his voice carrying an edge of violence that made several people in the crowd take a step backward. "I became exactly what you wanted me to become. A desperate man with nothing left to lose, willing to break any law and hurt anyone who got in my way of finding my wife." Sheriff Williams was beginning to see the shape of the conspiracy, and it made him angry in a way that simple crimes never did. He had spent his career dealing with men who killed for money or revenge or simple meanness. But there is something particularly disgusting about a crime designed to destroy people's souls as well as their lives. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," the sheriff said, addressing Thornton directly. "You're being accused of orchestrating Mrs. Mackenzie's kidnapping in order to drive her husband into becoming the kind of criminal who could be legally executed, thereby removing him as an obstacle to your business plans." "That's completely ridiculous," Thornton replied, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the morning chill. "Is it?" Sarah asked. "Then explain how I ended up beside that desert road with no memory and no identification. Explain how my husband spent 3 years believing I was dead while I was living just a few hundred miles away under a different name." Thomas cleared his throat nervously. "Sarah, when I found you, you had no personal belongings except for the clothes you were wearing. But there was one thing that struck me as odd. Your dress was expensive, much finer than what a woman traveling alone through the desert would normally wear. And it had been torn, but not by rocks or brush. It looked like it had been deliberately ripped, to make it look like she'd been attacked by bandits," Jack said grimly. "But they needed her alive, didn't they, Marcus? Because if Sarah had died, I might have given up and gone back to ranching. Instead, you made sure I'd spend years searching for her, becoming more desperate and more criminal with each passing month. Marcus Thornton's composure finally began to crack completely. You have no proof of any of this. These are the ramblings of a condemned man, and a woman whose mind was damaged by whatever tragedy befell her 3 years ago. But Sarah had remembered something else, something that made her pulse race with excitement and terror. "The man who took me," she said suddenly, "he had a scar across his left hand, shaped like a crescent, and he wore a ring with the initials MT engraved on it." She looked around the crowd until she found the face she was looking for. "There," she said, pointing to a thick-set man with dark hair who was standing near the edge of the gathering. "That's him. That's the man who was in our room that night." The man Sarah had pointed out began to edge backward through the crowd, but Sheriff Williams had already spotted him. "Bill Carver," the sheriff called out, "I think you'd better stay right where you are." Carver froze like a rabbit caught in an open field. He was a hired gun who had worked for various questionable employers throughout the territory, and everyone knew that he could be bought for the right price. "Show them your hand, Bill," Jack called out from the gallows. "Show them all that scar you got from a broken bottle during that bar fight in Tucson." Reluctantly, Carver held up his left hand. Even from a distance, the crescent-shaped scar was clearly visible. "And the ring?" Sarah asked, her voice deadly quiet. Carver's right hand moved instinctively to cover his left, but it was too late. The gold ring with the initials MT caught the morning sunlight. "You gave him your ring," Sarah said to Marcus Thornton. "You gave him your ring so that if anyone ever connected him to what happened, the trail would lead back to you. But you thought no one would ever remember, didn't you? You thought I'd either die in the desert or live the rest of my life with no memory of what had happened." Thornton was backing away now, his face pale and his confident demeanor completely shattered. "This proves nothing. Carver could have stolen that ring." He could have what? Sheriff Williams interrupted. "Could have coincidentally stolen a ring with your initials, and then coincidentally been involved in a kidnapping that coincidentally benefited your business interests. That's a lot of coincidences, Mr. Thornton." The crowd was growing restless, and not in Marcus Thornton's favor. Several of the townspeople were beginning to remember their own dealings with the mining magnate, occasions when he had been less than honest about his intentions or methods. Thomas Mackenzie stepped forward, his banker's training evident in the way he approached the situation methodically. "Sheriff, I think there's something else you should know. 3 months after I found Sarah and brought her down, Marcus Thornton approached me about a loan to expand his mining operations. He said he had recently acquired new water rights in Colorado that would make his investments much more profitable. Water rights that originally belonged to Jack Morrison's ranch," Jack added from the platform. "That's right," Thomas continued. "At the time, I thought it was just good business sense. But now I'm wondering how Mr. Thornton managed to acquire those rights so quickly after their original owner had apparently disappeared." Sheriff Williams turned to face Marcus Thornton directly. "Well, how did you acquire those water rights, Mr. Thornton?" For a moment, it looked like Thornton might continue trying to bluff his way out of the situation. But then he glanced around at the crowd of hostile faces, at Bill Carver, who was clearly preparing to run or fight, and at Jack Morrison, who was watching him with the patient intensity of a man who had waited 3 years for this moment. "All right," Thornton said finally, his voice flat and defeated. "All right, you want the truth?" "Yes, I arranged for Mrs. Morrison to be taken. Yes, I knew it would drive her husband to distraction. And yes, I profited from the chaos that followed." A collective gasp went up from the crowd, followed by angry murmurs that grew louder by the second. "But I never meant for anyone to be seriously hurt," Thornton continued desperately. "The plan was just to hide her away for a few months until Morrison gave up and sold his land. Then We would have let her go with some story about escaping from bandits. Then why didn't you? Sarah demanded, her eyes blazing with fury. Why did you leave me to die in the desert? Thornton's face crumbled. Because she fought back, he said, nodding toward Bill Carver. When Carver and his men tried to move her to a different hiding place, she managed to get away from them. She hit her head during the escape, and when they found her again, she was unconscious and bleeding. Carver panicked and dumped her beside the road, thinking she was going to die anyway. So you decided to let everyone believe that's exactly what had happened, Jack said, his voice deadly quiet. You let me spend 3 years thinking my wife was dead. You let her spend 3 years not knowing who she really was. You destroyed 2 lives and didn't lose a moment's sleep over it. I tried to make it right, Thornton protested weakly. When I heard that Morrison had become an outlaw, I tried to find ways to help him get captured alive. I thought maybe if he were in prison instead of on the run, there might be a chance to what? Sarah interrupted. To tell him his wife was alive, but living happily with another man? To let him rot in jail while I went on not remembering the life we had built together. Bill Carver had apparently decided that he'd heard enough confessions for one day. With a sudden movement, he broke through the crowd and began running toward the edge of town where his horse was tied. But he had underestimated the anger of the people around him. 3 townsmen tackled him before he'd gone 20 yards, and within moments he was surrounded by a circle of furious citizens who had just learned that they'd been living among the men responsible for turning Jack Morrison into the outlaw who had terrorized their territory for 3 years. Sheriff Williams drew his pistol and fired a shot into the air to restore order. "That's enough," he shouted. "This is still a legal proceeding, and we'll handle this according to the law." But the crowd was beyond the reach of legal niceties now. Someone shouted, "Hang them both," and the cry was quickly taken up by dozens of voices. Others began demanding that Jack Morrison be released immediately and that Marcus Thornton take his place on the gallows. Through it all, Sarah stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her mind reeling as 3 years of false memories crumbled around her, and the truth of her real life came flooding back. She remembered everything now. The small ranch where she and Jack had planned to raise horses, the quiet evenings when he would read to her by lamplight, the way he made her laugh even during the hardest times, the absolute certainty she had felt that she had found the person she was meant to spend her life with. And she remembered Thomas, too, the kindness he had shown her when she was lost and broken, the gentle way he had helped her build a new life when she couldn't remember her old one. She thought about the past 2 years, the quiet contentment she had found as his wife, the way he had loved her even knowing that she carried mysteries he might never understand. Now both men were looking at her, waiting for her to choose between the life she had lost and the life she had built from its ashes. And she realized that no matter what choice she made, someone was going to be destroyed by it. The chaos in the town square continued to build as Sheriff Williams struggled to maintain order among the angry crowd. Marcus Thornton had been placed in custody, his hands bound behind his back as he stood under guard near the gallows. Bill Carver was being held by several townsmen who looked ready to dispense their own form of justice if given the slightest provocation. But at the center of it all, Sarah stood perfectly still, feeling as if time had stopped around her. 2 lives, 2 identities, 2 completely different futures stretched out before her, and she knew that whatever decision she made in the next few moments would echo through eternity. Thomas approached her slowly, his face etched with pain, but his eyes still filled with the gentle kindness that had first drawn her to him. "Sarah," he said quietly, using the name he had called her for 2 years, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." She looked up at him, this good man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return except the chance to love her. "What do you want to know? Do you love him?" Thomas asked, nodding toward Jack on the gallows platform. "Not the memory of him, not the idea of what you lost, but him, the man he is now." It was the question Sarah had been dreading, because it forced her to confront the terrible complexity of her situation. She closed her eyes and let herself really look at Jack Morrison for the first time since her memories had returned. He was different from a man she had married 3 years ago. The gentle rancher who had courted her with wildflowers and shy smiles had been replaced by someone harder, more dangerous. The years of searching for her had carved lines of suffering around his eyes and carved calluses of violence on his soul. He had killed men in his quest to find her, robbed innocent people, terrorized communities. The Jack Morrison she had fallen in love with might never have been capable of such things, but this Jack Morrison had done them all. And yet, when she looked into those blue eyes, she still saw glimpses of the man who had promised to love her for better or worse, in sickness and health, until death parted them. She saw the anguish of someone who had been willing to sacrifice everything, including his own soul, for love. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "I love the man I married, but I don't know if that man still exists." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "And what about me? Do you love me?" This question was somehow even harder than the first. Sarah thought about the past 2 years, the quiet happiness she had found in her marriage to Thomas. It had been a different kind of love than what she had shared with Jack. Calmer, more peaceful, built on gratitude and companionship rather than passion and shared dreams. But it had been real. Thomas had loved her completely despite her lost memories and mysterious past. He had given her a home, a name, a place in the community. He had asked for nothing except the chance to make her happy, and, in many ways, he had succeeded. "Yes," she said simply, "I love you too." Thomas's face crumpled slightly, but he managed a sad smile. "I was afraid you'd say that." "Thomas, I know, it's all right," he interrupted gently. "I always knew that someday your past might catch up with you. I just hoped we'd have more time." From the gallows platform, Jack had been watching this exchange with growing desperation. "Sarah," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Sarah, please, look at me." Against her better judgment, she turned to face him. "I know I'm not the same man you married," Jack said, his voice raw with emotion. "I know the things I've done have changed me in ways that can't be undone. But everything I became for you. Every crime I committed, every law I broke, every moral line I crossed, it was all in service of finding you and bringing you home." "Home to what?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "The ranch is gone, isn't it? Sold to pay for your search or lost when you became an outlaw. The life we planned together was destroyed 3 years ago." Jack's face tightened. "We can build a new life. We can start over. I know it won't be easy, but with what money?" Sarah interrupted. "With what future? You're a wanted man, Jack. Even if they release you today, even if Marcus Thornton's confession clears you of these specific charges, there are other crimes, other victims. You can't just go back to being a rancher after 3 years as an outlaw." "Then we'll leave," Jack said desperately. "We'll go to Mexico or California. We'll change our names and start fresh somewhere no one knows us. And spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders." Sarah shook her head. "That's not the life we dreamed of, Jack. That's not the life either of us wanted." Sheriff Williams had been listening to this conversation while keeping one eye on the restless crowd. Now he stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Mrs. Mackenzie, or Mrs. Morrison, I should say, there's something you need to understand about the legal situation here, he said. If Mr. Thornton's confession is accurate, and if we can prove that Jack Morrison's crimes were committed as a direct result of the trauma inflicted by Thornton's conspiracy, there might be grounds for clemency. What do you mean? Thomas asked. I mean that a man driven to desperation by the illegal actions of others might not be held fully responsible for his subsequent crimes, especially if those crimes were committed in pursuit of a legitimate goal. In this case, finding his kidnapped wife. Jack's eyes lit up with hope for the first time since the execution had begun. You're saying I might not hang? I'm saying it's possible, Sheriff Williams replied carefully. But it would depend on a lot of factors. The governor would have to be convinced that justice would be better served by clemency than by execution. The families of your victims would have to be consulted, and you'd have to demonstrate genuine remorse for your actions and a willingness to make amends. I'll do anything, Jack said immediately. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the harm I've caused. I'll work to repay every dollar I stole. Oh, that's not the point, Sarah said quietly, cutting him off. Everyone turned to look at her, and she realized that the entire crowd had fallen silent to hear what she would say. The point is that we can't go back, she continued, her voice growing stronger. We can't undo the past 3 years. We can't pretend that none of this happened. You're not the man I married, and I'm not the woman you married. We're both different people now, shaped by different experiences and different choices. Jack's face went pale. Are you saying you won't come with me? Sarah looked at him, then at Thomas, then at the faces of the townspeople around her. These people had accepted her as one of their own, had welcomed her into their community despite her mysterious origins. Thomas had given her a life when she had nothing, and she had built something real and meaningful with him. But Jack had sacrificed everything for love of her, had destroyed himself in pursuit of the hope that they could be reunited. How could she abandon him now, when he had finally found her? I'm saying, Sarah said slowly, that I need time to figure out who I really am before I can decide who I want to spend my life with. The crowd murmured in disappointment. They had expected a dramatic declaration, a clear choice between the two men who loved her. Instead, they were getting the messy complexity of real life. Thomas stepped forward. What are you proposing? Sarah took a deep breath. I'm proposing that we delay any permanent decisions until we can sort out the legal situation and give everyone time to adjust to the truth. If Jack is granted clemency, if he can find a way to make amends for his crimes, then maybe we can explore whether there's still something between us worth saving. And if he isn't granted clemency? Thomas asked. Sarah's voice broke slightly. Then the choice will be made for us, won't it? Jack stared at her for a long moment, his face cycling through disappointment, anger, and, finally, a kind of resigned understanding. You're asking me to prove that I'm worth choosing. I'm asking you to prove that the man I fell in love with still exists somewhere inside the outlaw you became, Sarah replied. I'm asking you to show me that love can be about more than just possession and obsession. And what about me? Thomas asked. What am I supposed to do while you're figuring out whether you want to go back to your first husband? Sarah turned to him with tears in her eyes. I'm asking you to be the good man I know you are. I'm asking you to give me the time and space I need to make the right choice for everyone involved. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he struggled with emotions he couldn't quite name. Finally, he nodded slowly. All right, he said. All right, I can do that. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I'll always be grateful for the time we had together. You saved my life as much as I saved yours, Sarah. You taught me what it meant to love someone completely, and that's a gift I'll treasure regardless of what happens next. Sheriff Williams cleared his throat. Well then, It seems we have a plan of sorts. Jack Morrison, I'm going to postpone your execution pending a full investigation into Marcus Thornton's confession. You'll remain in custody, but I'll be sending a full report to the governor recommending that your case be reviewed for possible clemency. Thank you, Jack said, his voice hoarse with relief. Don't thank me yet, the sheriff warned. Clemency isn't the same as a pardon. Even if the governor agrees to commute your death sentence, you'll still face years in prison. And there's no guarantee that the governor will be sympathetic to your situation at all. I understand, Jack replied. I'll accept whatever punishment I deserve, as long as I have the chance to prove that I'm still the man Sarah married. Marcus Thornton, who had been standing silently under guard throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. And what about me? What's going to happen to me? Sheriff Williams turned to him with an expression of complete disgust. You, Mr. Thornton, are going to face charges for kidnapping, conspiracy, destruction of property, and about a dozen other crimes I can think of off the top of my head. And, unlike Mr. Morrison, you won't have the excuse of temporary insanity brought on by grief. But I cooperated, Thornton protested. I confessed. Doesn't that count for something? It counts for you not getting lynched by this crowd, the sheriff replied coldly. Beyond that, you'll have to convince a judge and jury that your cooperation makes up for 3 years of destroyed lives. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people breaking off into small groups to discuss the morning's revelations. Some were disappointed that the execution had been postponed, but most seemed satisfied that justice was being served, even if it was more complicated than they had expected. Sarah found herself standing alone as Thomas walked back toward the bank, and Jack was led away to his cell. For the first time in 3 years, she knew exactly who she was and where she had come from. The question now was where she was going. As she stood in the dusty town square, watching the sun climb higher in the desert sky, Sarah realized that her real journey was just beginning. She had 2 men who loved her, 2 possible futures stretching out before her, and no easy answers about which path would lead to happiness. But for the first time since her memories had returned, she felt something that had been missing from her life for 3 years. The sense that she was finally free to make her own choices about her own future. Whatever happened next, it would be her decision to make. 6 weeks had passed since the interrupted execution that had turned Sarah's world upside down. In that time, Dry Creek had become the center of a legal and media storm that drew attention from newspapers as far away as San Francisco and Chicago. The story of the outlaw who found his lost wife moments before his own execution captured the imagination of a nation hungry for tales of love and redemption in the harsh frontier. Sarah had moved into a boarding house near the center of town, unable to continue living with Thomas while she sorted through her feelings, but equally unable to simply abandon the life she had built over the past 2 years. Every day brought new challenges as she tried to reconcile her recovered memories with the person she had become. The boarding house room was small and sparsely furnished, with just a bed, a washstand, and a single chair by the window that overlooked the main street. Sarah spent long hours in that chair, watching the daily life of the town unfold below while she struggled to make sense of her own situation. Thomas visited her every few days, always polite and respectful, bringing her news from the bank and updates on the legal proceedings. Their conversations were stilted and painful, filled with the weight of everything they couldn't say to each other. He never pressed her for a decision, never asked when she might come home, but she could see the hope and hurt warring in his brown eyes every time he looked at her. Jack remained in the county jail, awaiting word from the territorial governor about his request for clemency. Sarah visited him twice a week, sitting across from him in the small visiting room while they tried to rebuild a relationship that had been shattered by 3 years of separation and trauma. These visits were the hardest part of Sarah's new routine. Every time she saw Jack, she was reminded of both the man she had fallen in love with and the dangerous stranger he had become. He was trying hard to be the gentle, thoughtful person she remembered, but 3 years of violence and desperation couldn't be erased overnight. The governor's advisor came to see me yesterday, Jack told her during one of their visits. He said they're still reviewing my case, but he wanted to ask me some specific questions about the crimes I committed. What kind of questions? Sarah asked, settling into the uncomfortable wooden chair across from him. Detailed questions about each robbery, each person I hurt. He wanted to know if I could provide information that might help them recover some of the stolen money or identify other criminals I might have worked with. Jack's hands, shackled to the table between them, clenched into fists. It was hard, Sarah. Hard to admit out loud all the things I did, all the people I hurt because I was so desperate to find you. Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of the man she had married. She could see glimpses of him sometimes in the way Jack's eyes softened when he talked about their life together, or in the careful way he spoke about his hopes for the future. But she could also see the hardness that 3 years of outlawry had carved into his soul. Do you regret it? She asked quietly. If you could go back and choose differently, would you? Jack was quiet for a long time, staring down at his shackled hands. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a pain so deep it made Sarah's chest ache. I regret the people I hurt, he said slowly. I regret the families I left without fathers and husbands. I regret the fear I caused and the trust one betrayed. But regret looking for you? Regret refusing to give up hope that you were alive somewhere. He shook his head. I can't regret that, Sarah, even knowing what it cost. I can't regret trying to find you, even though looking for me turned you into someone you never wanted to be. Even then, Jack leaned forward as far as his restraints would allow, because the alternative was accepting that you were gone forever, and I wasn't strong enough to do that. Maybe I should have been. Maybe a better man would have grieved for you and then found a way to move on with his life. But I loved you too much to let you go. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. And now that you've found me, but I'm not the same person you lost. Now I'm trying to become someone worthy of the woman you are today, not just the woman you were 3 years ago, Jack replied. I know I've changed, Sarah. I know I've done things that can never be undone. But I'm hoping that the part of me that loved you, the part that made me search for you against all odds, is still worth something. Before Sarah could respond, Sheriff Williams appeared in the doorway of the visiting room. Mrs. Mackenzie, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need to speak with you. There's been a development in Mr. Thornton's case. Sarah followed the sheriff to his office, her heart racing. Marcus Thornton had been in jail awaiting trial, but his expensive lawyers had been working overtime to find ways to minimize his legal exposure. What's happened? Sarah asked as she took a seat across from the sheriff's desk. Williams looked grim. Thornton's agreed to testify against some of his business associates in exchange for a reduced sentence. Apparently, your kidnapping wasn't the only illegal scheme he was involved in. He's been manipulating land deals, bribing officials, and using violence to intimidate competitors for years. That's good news, isn't it? If he's cooperating with the law. It's good news for the territory's efforts to clean up corruption in the mining industry, Williams replied. But it might complicate things for your husband's clemency petition. Sarah frowned. How so? Because Thornton's testimony is painting Morrison as more than just an innocent victim driven to desperation. According to Thornton, Morrison had a reputation for violence even before your disappearance. He's claiming that Morrison was already involved in questionable activities, and that your kidnapping just gave him an excuse to become the outlaw he was destined to become anyway. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. That's not true. Jack was a rancher, a peaceful man. He never— I'm not saying I believe Thornton, Williams interrupted gently. But the governor's office is going to have to consider his testimony when making their decision about clemency. And if they start to think that Morrison was already on a criminal path before your disappearance, they might be less inclined to show mercy. Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the jail. Marcus Thornton destroyed our lives, and now he's trying to destroy Jack's last chance at redemption. There's more, Williams said reluctantly. Thornton's lawyers have filed a motion claiming that Morrison's crimes were so extensive and violent that he represents an ongoing danger to public safety. They're arguing that clemency would be a miscarriage of justice, regardless of the circumstances that drove him to outlawry. Can they do that? Can a man who caused all of this speak against mercy for his victim? They can try. Whether the governor's office will listen is another matter. Williams leaned back in his chair. But there's something else you need to know. The families of the men Morrison killed have petitioned the governor as well. They're asking that justice be served regardless of the circumstances surrounding Morrison's crimes. Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Just when it seemed like there might be hope for Jack's redemption, new obstacles were emerging to block his path to clemency. "What can I do?" she asked desperately. "There has to be something I can do to help him." "You could testify at his clemency hearing," Williams suggested. "Your testimony about what really happened 3 years ago might carry significant weight with the governor's panel." "Of course I'll testify, but will it be enough?" "I don't know," Williams admitted. "But there's one more thing you should consider. Thomas Mackenzie has also requested permission to testify at the hearing." Sarah turned to stare at him. "Thomas? Why would Thomas want to testify?" "You have to ask him that yourself." But he seemed to think he had something important to say about the situation. That afternoon, Sarah walked to the bank where Thomas worked, her mind churning with questions and fears. She found him in his office, reviewing loan applications with a methodical care that characterized everything he did. "Thomas," she said from the doorway, "Sheriff Williams told me you want to testify at Jack's clemency hearing." Thomas looked up, his face carefully neutral. "Come in and close the door, Sarah. We need to talk." Sarah sat down across from his desk, studying his face for clues about what he was thinking. "What are you planning to say at the hearing?" "I'm going to tell them the truth," Thomas replied. "About you, about us, about what your disappearance cost everyone involved." "I don't understand." Thomas set down his pen and looked directly at her. "Sarah, I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past few weeks. About justice, about mercy, about what's really right in this situation. And what conclusion have you reached? That Jack Morrison is not the only victim of Marcus Thornton's scheme," Thomas said quietly. "You were a victim too, obviously. But so was I, in a different way." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "Thomas, I never meant to—" "I know you didn't," he interrupted gently. "You couldn't help falling in love with me any more than you could help losing your memory. But the fact remains that I built my happiness on a foundation of someone else's tragedy. I married a woman who belonged to another man, and I did it knowing that someday her past might catch up with us. That doesn't make you a villain, Thomas. You saved my life. Did I? Or did I just postpone the inevitable reckoning?" Thomas stood up and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "For 2 years, I've been telling myself that our marriage was a good thing, that we were making the best of a terrible situation. But lately, I've been wondering if I was just being selfish." "How can you say that? You gave me everything when I had nothing." Thomas turned back to her, his eyes filled with a sadness so deep it took her breath away. "I gave you everything except the truth, Sarah. I never encouraged you to try to remember your past. I never suggested that we search for your real identity. I was too afraid of losing you to risk helping you find out who you really were." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. "Are you saying you knew all along that I was married to someone else?" "No," Thomas replied quickly. "I had no idea about Jack Morrison specifically, but I knew you had a life before I found you, and I chose not to dig too deeply into what that life might have been. I told myself it was for your own good, that forcing you to remember might be harmful. But really, I just didn't want to face the possibility that you belonged somewhere else." Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. "What are you going to tell the clemency panel?" "I'm going to tell them that Jack Morrison deserves a chance at redemption, because the alternative is admitting that love can be selfish and destructive and still be considered noble." Thomas moved back to his desk and sat down heavily. "I'm going to tell them that if we don't show mercy to a man who is driven to desperation by love, then we're saying that love itself is no excuse for anything. And that's a world I don't want to live in, even though it means losing me." Thomas smiled sadly. "Sarah, I lost you the day your memory came back. I just haven't been willing to admit it yet." That evening, Sarah returned to her boarding house room, feeling more confused and conflicted than ever. Three people's futures hung in the balance, and somehow she had become the focal point around which all their fates would be decided. She sat by her window as the sun set over the desert, watching the last light fade from the sky and thinking about the impossible choices that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring the clemency hearing, and with it, the final resolution of a story that had begun with love and hope and descended into tragedy and violence. Whatever the governor's panel decided, Sarah knew that none of their lives would ever be the same. The question was whether the love that had started this whole tragic sequence of events would be strong enough to survive the reckoning that was about to come. The territorial courthouse in Phoenix was packed beyond capacity for Jack Morrison's clemency hearing. Word of the case had spread throughout the Southwest, drawing spectators, journalists, and curiosity seekers from hundreds of miles away. The story had everything that captured the public imagination: love, betrayal, redemption, and the eternal question of whether the ends could ever justify the means. Sarah sat in the front row, wearing the same blue dress she had worn on the day of the interrupted execution. It seemed appropriate somehow, as if this hearing was the true conclusion of the story that had begun in that dusty town square 6 weeks ago. Thomas sat beside her, despite everything that had passed between them. He had insisted on accompanying her to Phoenix, saying that whatever the outcome, she shouldn't have to face it alone. His quiet strength had been a comfort during the long train journey from Dry Creek, even though they both knew that this hearing would likely mark the end of their life together. Jack was brought in wearing shackles, but Sheriff Williams had arranged for him to be dressed in clean clothes rather than prison garb. He looked more like the man Sarah remembered from their wedding day, his hair trimmed and his face clean-shaven. When their eyes met across the courtroom, she saw hope and fear warring in his expression. The clemency panel consisted of 3 men: Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man with silver hair who had served on the territorial court for 15 years; Colonel Davies, a former military officer who now worked in the territorial administration; and Dr. Montgomery, a professor of law from the university who had been brought in to provide an objective perspective on the case. Judge Harrison called the hearing to order and read the charges against Jack Morrison in a clear, carrying voice. The list was long and serious: multiple counts of robbery, assault, and murder committed over a 3-year period. Under normal circumstances, these crimes would have warranted execution without question. However, Judge Harrison continued, This panel has been convened to consider whether extraordinary circumstances surrounding these crimes might warrant clemency. We will hear testimony from various parties and then make our recommendation to the territorial governor. The first witness was Marcus Thornton, brought from his own jail cell to testify about his role in the events that had led to Jack's criminal career. Thornton had lost weight during his weeks in custody, and his expensive clothes hung loosely on his frame. His silver hair was unkempt, and his confident demeanor had been replaced by the nervous manner of a man who knew his future depended on cooperation with the authorities. "Mr. Thornton," Judge Harrison began, "you have confessed to orchestrating the kidnapping of Sarah Morrison. Please explain to this panel the circumstances and motivations behind that crime." Thornton's voice was barely above a whisper as he recounted the story Sarah had already heard. He spoke about his desire to acquire Jack's ranch for its water rights, about his growing frustration when Jack refused to sell, and about his decision to use Sarah's disappearance as a weapon to break his opponent's will. "I never intended for anyone to be seriously harmed," Thornton insisted, his hands shaking as he gripped the witness stand. "The plan was to hide Mrs. Morrison for a few weeks or months until her husband gave up and sold his property. Then, we would have released her with some story about escaping from bandits." "But that's not what happened," Colonel Davies interjected. "No," Thornton admitted. "Mrs. Morrison fought back during the kidnapping. She was injured trying to escape, and my associates panicked. They left her beside a desert road, thinking she was going to die from her head injury. And you made no effort to ensure her survival or to inform her husband that she was alive." Thornton's face flushed with shame. "No, by the time I learned what had happened, weeks had passed. I told myself it was too late to fix the situation." Dr. Montgomery leaned forward. "Mr. Thornton, in your opinion, did Jack Morrison's criminal behavior result directly from your actions?" This was the question that could determine Jack's fate. Thornton was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the decision of how much truth to reveal. "I believe," he said finally, "that Mr. Morrison was already predisposed to violence. I had heard rumors about his temper, about incidents where he had settled disputes with his fists rather than through legal channels. My actions may have provided him with an excuse to embrace a criminal lifestyle, but I don't believe they created a criminal out of an innocent man." Sarah felt her heart sink, even faced with the ruin of his own life. Marcus Thornton was still trying to shift blame away from himself. The next witness was Sheriff Williams, who provided a detailed account of Jack's crimes and their investigation. He was careful to remain objective, presenting the facts without editorial comment. But the weight of Jack's criminal record was crushing. 3 banks robbed, with a total of $12,000 stolen, Williams testified. 4 stagecoaches held up, with additional thefts totaling nearly $8,000. 2 lawmen killed during attempted arrests, and 6 civilians wounded during various robberies. When asked about Jack's behavior since his capture, Williams was more positive. "The defendant has been cooperative and has provided information that has helped us recover some of the stolen money and arrest several of his associates. He has expressed genuine remorse for his actions and has requested the opportunity to make restitution to his victims' families." The third witness was Dr. Emma Patterson, a physician who had examined Sarah after her memories returned. Dr. Patterson was a small, precise woman with steel-gray hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Patterson testified, "Mrs. Morrison suffered a severe traumatic brain injury during her kidnapping that resulted in retrograde amnesia. This condition caused her to lose all memories of her life prior to the injury, including her identity and her marriage. Is such memory loss common in cases of head trauma? Judge Harrison asked. It's not unusual, though the extent of Mrs. Morrison's memory loss was quite severe. In most cases, some memories return gradually over time. The fact that Mrs. Morrison's memories remained completely suppressed for 3 years suggests that the trauma was both physical and psychological. Could the emotional trauma of witnessing violence contribute to memory loss? Absolutely. The mind sometimes protects itself from unbearable pain by simply forgetting the events that caused that pain. When Dr. Patterson was dismissed, Judge Harrison called for a brief recess. Sarah used the break to step outside into the desert air, trying to calm her racing heart. The testimony so far had been damaging to Jack's case, and she knew that her own testimony might be his last hope for clemency. Thomas appeared beside her on the courthouse steps. "How are you holding up?" "I'm terrified," Sarah admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I can't convince them that Jack deserves mercy?" "You just need to tell the truth," Thomas said gently. "Tell them about the man you married, and let them decide whether that man is worth saving." When the hearing reconvened, Sarah was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand on unsteady legs, acutely aware that dozens of eyes were watching her every movement. This was the moment that everyone had been waiting for. The testimony of the woman whose love had inspired both great devotion and terrible violence. Judge Harrison's voice was kind, but businesslike. "Mrs. Morrison, please tell this panel about your relationship with the defendant and the circumstances of your disappearance." Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak. She told them about meeting Jack at a church social in Denver, about his gentle courtship and the quiet way he had made her laugh. She described their wedding day, the hopes they had shared for their future together, and the happiness she had felt as they began their life as husband and wife. "Jack was not a violent man when I married him," she said firmly. "He was a hard worker who believed in solving problems through honest effort and fair dealing. He had never been in trouble with the law, and he spoke often about his desire to build something lasting and good." "Then what changed?" Colonel Davies asked. "What changed was that the man he loved and trusted to build a life with was torn away from him in the most brutal manner possible," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger. "Jack didn't become an outlaw because he was naturally criminal. He became an outlaw because he was driven to desperation by love and hope and the refusal to accept that I was gone forever." Dr. Montgomery leaned forward with interest. "Are you saying that you condone the defendant's criminal actions?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "I'm saying that I understand them. Jack committed terrible crimes, and innocent people suffered because of his actions. Nothing can excuse that, and nothing can undo the harm that was done. But I know why he did those things, and I believe that understanding the why is important when deciding what justice should look like." "And what do you believe justice should look like in this case?" "I believe Jack should pay for his crimes, but I also believe he should be given the chance to spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for them. Executing him won't bring back the men he killed or ease the suffering of their families. But allowing him to live might give him the opportunity to do some good in the world, to balance the scales in some small way." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Morrison, there's a question that I think everyone in this courtroom wants to ask, and I hope you'll forgive the personal nature of it. If this panel recommends clemency and the defendant's life is spared, do you intend to resume your marriage to him?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah was aware that her answer might influence the panel's decision, and she struggled with the temptation to say what they might want to hear rather than what she honestly felt. "I don't know," she said finally. "I know that I still love the man I married 3 years ago, but I also know that 3 years of violence and desperation have changed Jack in ways that can't be erased. If he's granted clemency, if he's given the chance to rebuild his life, then maybe we can find a way to rebuild our relationship as well. But that would take time and work and forgiveness on both sides. And what about Mr. Mackenzie, the man who has been your husband for the past 2 years? Sarah glanced toward Thomas, who was watching her with an expression of infinite sadness and understanding. Thomas Mackenzie saved my life and gave me a reason to hope when I had lost everything, she said, her voice thick with emotion. He loved me completely despite not knowing who I really was, and he showed me what genuine kindness and selflessness look like. Whatever happens with Jack, I will always be grateful to Thomas for the gift he gave me. When Sarah was dismissed, there was one final witness, Thomas himself. Thomas approached the witness stand with quiet dignity, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered conviction. Gentlemen, he began, I want to tell you what I've learned about love and justice over the past few weeks. When I found Sarah beside that desert road 3 years ago, I thought I was rescuing her. I thought I was being noble and selfless by giving her a new life when she couldn't remember her old one. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But lately I've come to understand that love isn't always noble, and it isn't always selfless. Sometimes love is possessive and controlling, even when it doesn't mean to be. I loved Sarah, but I also wanted to keep her, and that wanting made me less interested in helping her discover the truth about her past than I should have been. Judge Harrison frowned slightly. Are you saying you deliberately withheld information about Mrs. Morrison's identity? No, Thomas replied. I had no specific information to withhold, but I didn't try as hard as I could have to help her recover her memories or find her family. I was too afraid of losing her to risk finding out where she belonged. Colonel Davies looked puzzled. Mr. Mackenzie, why are you telling us this? How does it relate to the defendant's case? Thomas straightened his shoulders. Because I think Jack Morrison and I made the same mistake, just in different ways. He loved Sarah so much that when she was taken from him, he was willing to destroy himself and hurt innocent people in his desperate attempt to get her back. I loved her so much that when I found her, I was willing to let her live a lie rather than risk losing her to the truth. The courtroom was completely silent now. Both of us claimed to love Sarah, but both of us put our own needs and fears ahead of what was truly best for her. The difference is that Jack's version of selfish love led him to become a criminal, while my version led me to become complicit in hiding the truth. Dr. Montgomery leaned back in his chair, clearly intrigued by this unexpected testimony. What are you asking this panel to do with this information, Mr. Mackenzie? I'm asking you to consider the possibility that Jack Morrison's crimes were the acts of a man driven insane by love and loss, not the acts of a natural criminal. I'm asking you to give him the chance to prove that he can be better than his worst moments, because that's a chance that all of us deserve. Thomas paused, looking directly at Jack for the first time since entering the courtroom. And I'm asking you to consider that if we don't show mercy to people who have been broken by love, then we're saying that love itself is worthless when it leads to pain. I don't want to live in a world where that's true. When Thomas was dismissed, Judge Harrison announced that the panel would deliberate and deliver their recommendation within 2 hours. The courtroom emptied slowly, with most of the spectators gathering outside to await the verdict. Sarah found herself standing alone with Jack in a small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, supervised by a guard but allowed a few minutes to speak privately. Whatever they decide, Jack said quietly, I want you to know that finding you again, even like this, has been worth everything I've been through. these past few weeks, being able to see you and talk to you, have given me back pieces of myself that I thought were lost forever. Jack, Sarah began, but he held up his hand to stop her. Let me finish. I know I'm not the same man you married. I know I've done things that can't be forgiven or forgotten. But if they give me the chance, I want to spend whatever time I have left trying to become someone worthy of the love you gave me 3 years ago. And if they don't give you that chance, Jack smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the man she had fallen in love with. Then I'll go to my death knowing that I fought for something worth fighting for. That has to count for something, doesn't it? 2 hours later, the panel returned with their recommendation. Judge Harrison stood to address the packed courtroom, his face revealing nothing about the decision they had reached. The case of Jack Morrison presents this panel with questions that go to the heart of what justice means in a civilized society. He began. We have heard testimony about love and loss, about crimes committed and prices paid, about the difference between explanation and excuse. Sarah held her breath, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. After careful deliberation, this panel has reached a unanimous decision. We recommend that the territorial governor commute Jack Morrison's death sentence to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and protests. Sarah felt her knees give out, and she sank back in her seat as relief washed over her. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued, raising his voice over the noise, we recommend that Mr. Morrison be allowed to work during his incarceration to make restitution to the families of his victims, and that his case be reviewed for possible early parole if he demonstrates genuine rehabilitation and makes substantial progress toward repaying his debts to society. The judge's voice grew more solemn. We want to be clear that this recommendation is not an endorsement of vigilante justice or crimes committed in the name of love. Jack Morrison's actions caused immeasurable harm to innocent people, and no amount of personal tragedy can excuse that harm. However, we believe that justice is best served by offering the possibility of redemption rather than simply exacting vengeance. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah made her way to where Jack was being prepared for transport back to prison. She had only a moment to speak with him before he was taken away. Jack, she said, reaching through the bars to touch his hand, 15 years is a long time. It's a lifetime I didn't think I was going to have, he replied, squeezing her fingers gently. Sarah, I don't expect you to wait for me. I don't expect anything from you except maybe a letter now and then letting me know that you're happy. I don't know what I'm going to do, Sarah admitted. I don't know where I belong or who I'm supposed to be now that I remember everything. You're supposed to be whoever you choose to be, Jack said firmly. You get to decide what your life looks like from here. That's something no one can take away from you ever again. As Jack was led away, Sarah felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Thomas standing behind her, his hat in his hands, and his expression gentle. What happens now? She asked him. Now you figure out what Sarah Morrison wants out of life, he replied. Not what Sarah Mackenzie settled for. Not what other people expect from you, but what you actually want. They walked out of the courthouse together into the bright Arizona sunshine. The story that had begun 3 years ago with a wedding and a kidnapping was finally drawing to a close, but Sarah realized that it was also the beginning of something new. Over the following weeks, as the legal proceedings concluded and the media attention faded, Sarah began the slow process of rebuilding her identity. She returned to Dry Creek long enough to collect her belongings and say goodbye to the friends she had made there. Some of them understood her decision to leave. Others felt betrayed by what they saw as her abandonment of Thomas and the life she had built with him. Thomas himself was gracious to the end. He helped her settle her affairs and made no demands on her time or emotions. On the day she left Dry Creek for good, he walked her to the train station and pressed a letter into her hand. "Don't read it now," he said. "Read it when you're ready to remember the good parts of what we had together." Sarah kept the letter, but it was months before she felt strong enough to open it. When she finally did, she found 3 pages of Thomas's careful handwriting, filled with memories of their quiet life together and his hopes for her future happiness. There was no bitterness in it, no recriminations or attempts to make her feel guilty. It was simply the gift of a good man's love, freely given and freely released. Sarah settled in California, in a small coastal town where no one knew her story. She found work as a teacher in the local school and slowly began building a new life that was entirely her own. She wrote to Jack regularly, letters that chronicled her daily life and her slow journey toward understanding who she was when she wasn't defined by her relationships to other people. Jack's letters in return were thoughtful and increasingly hopeful. He wrote about the work he was doing to earn money for restitution, about the books he was reading, and about his growing understanding of the man he had been and the man he hoped to become. He never pressured her to make commitments or promises about the future, but she could sense his quiet hope that someday they might find their way back to each other. 3 years into Jack's sentence, Sarah received a letter that was different from all the others. In it, Jack wrote that he had been offered the opportunity to work on a road-building crew outside the prison, a chance that would allow him to earn real wages and make faster progress on his restitution payments. But it would also mean less time for correspondence and fewer opportunities for visits. "I want to take this job," he wrote, "because I believe it's the right thing to do. But I also want you to know that if you've decided you don't want to wait for me, I'll understand completely. You've already given me more than I had any right to expect by helping me remember who I used to be. If you want to move on with your life, to find someone who can give you the happiness you deserve right now, rather than asking you to wait for an uncertain future, I'll support that decision." Sarah read the letter 3 times before she understood what Jack was really saying. He was releasing her from any obligation she might feel to wait for him, giving her permission to build a life that didn't revolve around his imprisonment and eventual release. That night, Sarah walked along the Pacific shore, listening to the sound of waves crashing against the rocks and thinking about the choices that lay before her. She could continue her quiet life as a teacher, perhaps eventually meeting someone who could offer her companionship without the complications of a criminal past. She could start fresh, completely free from the tragic history that had shaped so much of her adult life. Or she could choose to believe that love was strong enough to survive 15 years of separation, that the man she had married was worth waiting for despite everything that had happened between them. The answer, when it came to her, was surprisingly simple. Sarah returned to her small house and sat down at her kitchen table to write the most important letter of her life. "Dear Jack," she began, "I've been thinking about what you wrote about giving me permission to move on with my life. I want you to know that I appreciate the gesture, but it's not necessary. I'm not waiting for you because I feel obligated to wait. I'm waiting because I choose to wait because I believe that what we had together is worth preserving, and because I want to find out what kind of life we can build together when we're both finally free to make our own choices." She paused, thinking about how to express the rest of what she felt. "I know that 15 years is a long time, and I know that both of us will continue to change and grow during those years. I can't promise that the people we are when you're released will be the same people who fell in love 3 years ago. But I can promise that I'll do my best to become someone worthy of the love you've shown me. And I hope you'll do the same." Sarah sealed the letter and mailed it the next morning. Jack's response came 3 weeks later, and when she opened it, a single pressed wildflower fell out onto her kitchen table. "Thank you," the letter said simply, "for choosing hope over safety, love over convenience, and faith over fear. I promise I'll spend every day of the next 12 years trying to become the man you deserve to come home to." 12 years later, on a bright morning in spring, Sarah stood on the platform of the train station in Phoenix, wearing a blue dress and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her hair was streaked with silver now, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of years of teaching children and building a life that was entirely her own. When Jack stepped off the train, she almost didn't recognize him. Prison had changed him, just as the years had changed her. He was leaner, more weathered, with gray threading through his dark hair and new scars on his hands from years of hard labor. But when he smiled at her, she saw the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. These two people who had been separated by crime and tragedy and brought together again by the simple choice to believe that love could survive anything. "Hello, Sarah," Jack said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Hello, Jack," she replied. "Welcome home." They were different people now than they had been on their wedding day 15 years earlier. They had been shaped by loss and trauma, by separation, and hope by the long, slow work of forgiveness and redemption. The naive young couple who had promised to love each other for better or worse had been tested in ways they never could have imagined. But as they walked out of the train station together, Sarah realized that their love story wasn't ending. It was finally beginning. They had survived the worst that life could throw at them, and they had chosen each other again despite having every reason to walk away. Whatever came next would be built on a foundation of choice rather than circumstance, of mature love rather than youthful passion, of hard-won wisdom rather than innocent hope. And for the first time in 15 years, that felt like enough to build a lifetime on. The desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, but also beautiful in its harsh honesty. Somewhere out there was the life they would build together, a life earned through suffering and shaped by grace. They walked toward it hand in hand, two survivors of a love story that had nearly destroyed them both. Finally, free to discover what redemption could look like when it was freely chosen rather than desperately sought. Behind them, the train whistle echoed across the empty landscape, carrying with it the sound of endings and beginnings of justice and mercy, of love that had endured long enough to become something stronger than either passion or obsession. It had become, finally, simply love itself, patient, enduring, and wise enough to know that the best stories are the ones where everyone gets the chance to choose their own ending.